Welcome to episode 1 of this series, Exploring Water and Arkansas State Parks. We begin at Mount Magazine, the highest point in the state. Here at the top of the landscape, water doesn't end its journey, it begins. This is where the headwaters form and where every downstream story starts. Imagine standing at the highest point in Arkansas, at Mount Magazine. The wind moves through the cliffs here in a way that feels constant. Like it has been doing the same thing for a very long time, without needing to change direction or intensity. Standing at the highest point in Arkansas, it is easy to focus outward. The view naturally pulls your attention in every direction. The valleys dropping away beneath you, the forests spreading across the landscape, and the distant horizon fading into layers of blue and gray that almost seems endless. But that's what's interesting, that the longer you stand there, the less view feels like the main story, and more it starts to feel like something else is happening beneath it. Something you wouldn't notice unless you slow down enough to think about what the landscape is actually doing. Because somewhere beneath your feet, it's something just beginning. Water doesn't really start here as anything dramatic. There's no river cutting through the rocks yet, no obvious movement across the surface. It's something that starts in a much smaller, less noticeable way. A drop of rain hits a rock and spreads. Another sinks into the soil. A little bit collects in a depression in the ground. Slowly starts to move in whatever direction gravity allows. At first, it doesn't look like anything important. It just looks like a wet ground. But that is where everything begins. This is Mount Magazine. At 2,753 feet above sea level, it is the highest point in Arkansas. That fact alone makes it a landmark. But elevation by itself isn't what really matters here. What matters is what elevation changes how water behaves. Higher elevation means cooler temperatures, more rainfall, slower evaporation, stays in the system longer instead of disappearing quickly into heat or runoff. And because of that, this place becomes what is called a headwater region. Headwaters are basically the starting point of a river system. They're small streams, springs, and runoff channels that don't usually look like anything special when you first see them. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, headwater systems make up the majority of stream miles in the United States. Which is surprisingly, if you think about it, how we often picture rivers as large. Most rivers don't really begin as rivers. They begin as this. What's happening here at Mount Magazine is mostly invisible unless you pay attention to the details. Rain falls into the forest canopy first, and a portion of it never reaches the ground. Leaves hold onto it, branches slow it down, and what does make it into the soil moves at a much slower pace than you would expect. The forest itself plays a big role in that. Tree roots stabilize the soil so the slope doesn't wash away. Fallen leaves act like a sponge, absorbing the rain and slowly releasing it. That combination of soil structure, vegetation, elevation creates a system where it is given time to move gradually instead of rushing downhill immediately. As it moves through the soil of sandstone, it gets filtered. Sediment is reduced, temperature is stabilized. The water becomes cleaner and more consistent before it even becomes part of a visible stream. So, in a way, what leaves this place isn't water in its raw form. It's water that has already been shaped by the environment. And that matters more than it might seem at first. Because every major river system in Arkansas, every floodplain, wetland, and every agricultural water source downstream eventually traces back to the systems like this. Not necessarily this exact mountain, but the places that function in the same way. Quiet beginnings that don't look significant, but they are the starting point of everything. And that means headwaters are more important than they look. At the same time, they are also fragile. If too much forest is removed, the system stops working in the same way. Water no longer is soaked in. Instead of it runs across the surface quickly, carrying soil with it, which increases erosion, clouds, streams with sediment. The rise in water temperature as it moves faster and is more exposed. Those changes don't just stay here. They move downstream, affecting ecosystems that stay dependent on stable and cool, clean water. So even though this place looks like a scenic overview, it's actually a part of a much larger system that depends on its balance. And that balance is here. That's what makes Mount Magazine feel different. Once you think about it in this way, it isn't just a place that overlooks the landscape. It's a place where the landscape begins to move. What happens here doesn't stay here. Here on the mountaintop. It flows outwards and downwards, connecting everything below it. Through creeks, rivers, valleys, through systems that eventually reach communities and farms, wetlands and cities that never think about where the water actually started. But it does start somewhere. And often it starts in a place like this. There is something kind of important about this realization, because it suggests that the most influential parts of the system are not always the visible ones. They are often the quietest, the easiest to overlook, the easiest to walk past without noticing. Nothing else works the same way. So when rain begins to fall at the top of the mountain, it isn't just weather that is happening in a moment. It's the beginning of a movement that will continue long after you leave. Water will travel through soil, stone, forest, and slope. It will gather, divide, and join again, eventually becoming something much larger than we are seeing right now. And all of that begins here. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, at the top of Arkansas.